welcome you all here. My name is Dale Lehman. I direct the MBA program here at APU and chair the Business Administration Department. And I'm here to introduce tonight's speaker. I have a few people to thank first. I'd like to thank the Walter J. and Ermelie Hickel Foundation for sponsoring this is the first of a series of visiting scholars in strategic leadership and entrepreneurship. And I want to thank the APU President's Forum for co-sponsoring the receptions outside. And I want to thank all of you for coming tonight. Maybe the weather helped. Not much to give up today. I need my notes because Michael has done so many things that I'll lose track of otherwise. So Michael Lissack is currently Executive Director of the Institute for the Study of Coherence and Emergence. And I just love this title, Professor of Meaning and Organizations. A visiting research professor at George Washington University, and he described himself as a serial entrepreneur. He founded both a nonprofit research institute, a charity for the arts, launched an international PhD program in corporate anthropology, written half a dozen books, and a successful Wall Street banker, and a candidate for public office. In 1999, Work magazine called him one of Wall Street's 25 smartest players, and in 2001, one of the 100 Americans who have most influence how we think about money. Also, he's been an investment banker. In 1998, he initiated a whistleblower suit against the unethical practices of Wall Street firms. Well, you may want to hold that because he's also currently has a successful real estate practice. And I do want to mention that he is teaching a course, a 2-credit course for undergraduate or graduate credit. You can still enroll in it. It doesn't start until tomorrow. So, Michael Lissack, welcome.
Thank you. Becky, just let it say APUIT. It doesn't matter.
It's showing the audience, not you.
So how far did you get with your lawsuit against Wall Street?
We won 84 out of 85 suits. And Wall Street had to pay back about $1 billion. Before you get too excited, unfortunately, Wall Street is Wall Street. So what ended up occurring is we lost the 85th suit. When we lost the 85th suit, Wall Street decided that meant the court system thought they were allowed to do it again. So they proceeded to then spend 5 years redoing everything that we had already sued them. So the Justice Department is now in round 2. The difference is the first time the Justice Department could not make it criminal because Wall Street said, look, everyone is doing it, and because everyone is doing it, we did not know it was a crime. Round 2, they were not allowed to use that defense. So this time around, they have Justice Departments collected so far about $100 million, and now there are 17 people in jail. So it's a little different this time. And as you can tell, we're having minor technical difficulties. So I'm supposed to do something in the alternate while we're doing this. I am not a very good dancer. Sorry.
Let me ask you a question.
Of course.
Take up a little time. What's the name of the course you're teaching and giving tomorrow?
Better thinking about theory, thinking, complexity, coherence, and context, which is the same thing as what's up there whenever you can get to the back of it. This is the 1 hour and something minute summary of what we will be doing starting tomorrow. And the way it works is it's 3 full days in person, and then it's 6 weeks online. It's 2 credits, and yes, it is available, and we have more seats.
And it's local?
Yes, it will be in this building in room 226.
You can contact me. I will be here in the office if you're interested in it.
She will be more than happy to sign you up.
I will be happy. My name is Issue, YISHU, and my phone number is 564-8234.
Or you just show up in room 226 tomorrow, and then she'll sign you up.
What time?
8:30 is.
8:30 in the morning. Don't worry, I'm not going to do that to you all 3 days in a row, but we have housekeeping stuff tomorrow morning. With that, I think we're ready to begin. I've got double thumbs up in the back, so without further ado, away we go. Or maybe not. Yes, good. So the topic is, do we actually do a good job when we're thinking? And is there a better way to think about how we go about doing our thinking? So there are questions that we should be asking as we're going through all of this. Whoops. That didn't work. Okay, good. So are we looking at the right things in our environment? Are we sufficiently self-aware of the things that are in our heads, of our beliefs, of where we've come from, of where we're going? Do we have the right words or the right representations to express what it is we're thinking about? And do we know the limitations? If we actually don't have the right tools, do we have enough self-awareness of the fact that we may or may not have the right tools? So there are questions that we need to be asking ourselves when we're thinking. Are we being rational? Are we being instead emotional? And if this was a cognitive science lecture, which it isn't, but if it were, the latest theory in cognitive science about our thinking is that there are two processes. That we have a rational process and that we have an emotional, intuitive process. And the cognitive scientists would tell you that this one almost always wins. Emotional. And that the latest theory is, and Becky's coming down to say it's not working again? Do I have to start over?
No.
Okay. So the dual process theory says that most of the time we allow our emotions and our intuition to make the decisions about what we're doing. However, right before you are ready to articulate, embody, or enact, so whenever you're actually going to turn whatever it is you're supposedly thinking about into an action or a thought, your rational system wakes up. And it says, can I tell a good story about this? And if you can tell a good story about this, and we can tell lots of stories about Becky, then if you can tell a good story about this, then the rational system lets whatever your emotions or intuition decide, go ahead. And if it can't, then supposedly, again, this is cognitive science theory, then supposedly your rational system says, wait, stop, veto. I can't tell a good story about this. And you get plunged into uncertainty while your brain is trying to figure out what to do. But again, that's the entire extent of the Cog-Sci lecture. We move on. So again, are we being rational? Are we being emotional? And what is it we're relying on as we're thinking and making decisions? So we have to keep in mind that our knowledge and our intuition are often in conflict. So the examples I've got up are, our knowledge may say this, which is that 75% of the time we'd be better off to do A. And yet, our intuition is based on what your mother told you. And Ma said, never do A. These things could be in conflict. Now, I'm sure many of you have read the book Blink or heard of it, or similar things. Now, there's a mistake in that book, and it's a very bad mistake. And the mistake in the book is the book seems to make the point that your intuition is usually right. Well, educated, experienced intuition is usually right. Naive intuition is usually wrong. And let me give you a very simple example. If we were to go to the Iowa State Fair and ask the participants in the Iowa State Fair to look at a hog and tell you what they think it weighs, on average, the participants at the Iowa State Fair are going to get the hog's weight correct. If we did exactly the same thing by stopping 1,000 random people in Times Square in New York City, I can guarantee to you that if they did get it right, it would be sheer coincidence. And the difference is the people that attend the Iowa State Fair are used to looking at hogs and what they weigh. And most of the people that go through Times Square have absolutely no idea. This is alien to their experience. So what happens is, when you're ignorant, your intuition is ill-informed. And the book, Blink, and the things that are like it don't make that distinction. The wisdom of crowds works if you have an educated crowd. It does not work when you have an ignorant crowd. And if it does, it's just sheer coincidence. And the media tends to just completely leave this out. But it is a very important difference. Now, the other thing that happens is that rationality and emotion often collide. And you've got to then decide which thing you're going to do and how you're going to think about it. And you've got to know which one is actually clear thinking. So again, I want to give you, this is not a cognitive science lesson, but the cognitive scientists will tell you that nice story about emotion does this, and then the rational thing exercises a veto. I'm going to put on a different hat, and I'm going to tell you that in my life I've probably managed around 3,000 people. And many of them have had difficult situations. When they've had the difficult situations, my advice has usually been the same. Take what's going on and please write out very carefully the two columns, pro and con, or choice A and choice B. Write it out and reach some rational decision. Now, please, take those pieces of paper, shove them in your desk, go home and do something else. Do not think about this again. When you come in the morning, if the decision you wrote down is still bothering you, please do the other thing. So my advice is that there's something going on with the intuition, the unarticulated stuff, over the longer haul that does tend to outweigh the rational thing. So this question of which one is the better option, which one is clear thinking, is not at all clear. And by the way, for those who are concerned with political correctness, please notice that yes, that is a female character, and yes, I did use a stereotype, and yes, I apologize. Right? I don't want someone to think I did not notice. All right, so if we have unlimited time and unlimited resources, the reality is we can always try all the options, take the one that seems to work the best, and throw the rest of them away. But 90-something% of the time, maybe 99% of the time, we don't have unlimited time, we don't have unlimited resources, we cannot do this. So it's nice that in theory this works, but we don't live in a world where the theory actually applies. So instead, we do what's known as triage. So the first thing we do is we try to limit what it is we're paying attention to. What is it that matters to us? Or what is it that's going to matter to us at this moment? Then we limit the factors that we're going to take into account. So sure, when I agreed to come here, I maybe should have taken into account what the weather was going to be. It really wasn't one of my decisions. All right? Maybe I should have taken into account that the USS Anchorage was going to come here to be commissioned. I didn't even know about it. It was outside of my field of attention and certainly wasn't a factor I considered. Maybe I should have. There'd be more people here tonight. But it is what it is. All right? Then the next thing that we tend to do is we predict likely outcomes. And then finally, we choose amongst our predictions and start working backwards. This is our normal triage method. So again, we filter almost without thought. What is it that we should be doing? We narrow our context. We assert boundaries about what it is we're going to consider. We then try to create our own reality by saying just what is it that these outcomes are that are likely to happen. And then having done that, we then choose among our predictions. I will point out, we could be completely wrong. It could be that in our narrowing down, we left out all the things that actually matter. So for all I know, and for all any of you know, maybe President Obama's on that boat today. And if that's the case, then this all was a bad decision to be sitting here. Maybe. Who knows? But we didn't know that. So Daniel Kahneman won a Nobel Prize in economics with regard to decision theory, and this is a quote from him, and it's here for you to read. But the basic point is, we don't necessarily make good choices. most of the time we actually choose rather badly. We have biases, we have beliefs, we have all kinds of things that distort what seems to be a good choice. So again, let's take where we are so far. Malcolm Gladwell in Intuition said, oh, we can rely on our intuition, we can do blink. Except all of the research says, if it isn't really filled with experience, if it isn't based on stuff, and if you aren't aware of the biases that you've got going on, those nice intuitive choices may really be garbage. But again, we don't tend to teach people this. We don't tend to think about it. So the big lesson is context matters, and we tend to forget that. And when we forget it, what happens? Well, the predictions that we were working backwards from could be the wrong predictions. It could be that the boundaries that we've defined the problem by are the wrong boundaries. It's actually a different problem. There's actually different things we need to be considering. It may be that we pay total attention to the wrong thing. And if that's the case, if that's what's going on, then that which seems to be rational to us, that which seems to be our good thinking, instead becomes a muddled up mess. And keep in mind, most of the time, the education processes that we're either in or have been through teach you to go through this nice, logical, linear, rational chain of thought, which is great if you paid attention to the right things, you got the boundaries and constraints right, and your predictions were okay. But they don't bother telling you if. So we do have other fields of study that are designed to deal with some of these questions. And I've got some of them listed up here. So there's science, there's philosophy, there's history, there's psychology. And then me, who does systems thinking for a living, has to say we have to add in systems thinking. So we have a goal, and the goal is, how do we make sense of things? How do we decide that we understand enough of what's going on that we can actually act, that we can hold things together? So what do? Well, we try to take into account the resources available to us, the constraints that we're operating under, the beliefs that we and others that we have to deal with have, the history of what's been going on, whatever it is that we have access to for knowledge and information, and something that everybody's aware of, but we tend also not to talk about all that much. Will. We make choices. We have many reasons for making choices. And sometimes those choices have nothing to do with any of these other things. But they may make perfect sense to us just out of will. So, coherence is our goal, but, and this is a very important but, it turns out there's two different kinds of coherence. So, it may be that we've got what seems to be the right way of thinking, going for consistent, this kind of coherence, which is the coherence of consistency. And what we need, because we're trying to act, is instead the coherence of experience. And they're different. And again, if you were taking the class, we're going to get into this chart at great length. For people who want to find a reference to it later, I will give you a reference to where you can get into it more. It is not, it would take us all the rest of the night to go through all of this. But the point is, the two kinds of coherence are very different. They look at the world differently. They use the same word. They both are called coherence. They both are about making sense. Their context is different. So we get the joy of trying to parse our way through things. This, by the way, is a real sign that I found in China. Or one of my more favorite examples. And then this one, which I think illustrates the entire problem. I can make sense out of this either way. So what I want to do for the rest of what's going on tonight, and again, what will happen in the class, is introduce you to some other perspectives for what's going on so that you have a different set of tools to be thinking about things. Now, I'm about to put on some big words, and I don't want anyone to get scared about the big words. The point of all of this is the three areas, the three perspectives that I'm going to put up there, ask different questions. And the key takeaway from tonight, and the key takeaway that'll happen in the course is that if you go through the exercise of asking all these questions, you will think differently about things. So all I want you to do is be aware that these are the kinds of questions that maybe we should be asking. And they're not the kinds of questions that our traditional education system teaches us to ask. All right, so the first area is ontology. Nice big word. Ontology is about that which is. So the questions in ontology are, what is? What do we mean by existence, etc.? Big, heavy stuff. But the questions will all be about what is in the world we're dealing with. The second word is epistemology. Epistemology is about how do we come to know things? What is the basis of our knowledge? So these questions are going to be, once we've decided what is, how do we go about examining what we know about what is? Are we asking the right questions about those things? Have we revealed the right context? Have we revealed the right factors? And then finally, another nasty word, praxology. This is the study of action. What is the basis of our acting? And these three things intertwine if we want to understand action, again, from the perspective of what question should we be asking? So, if I put that backwards, if you ask them together, we're asking what is it that we know and how do we know it? How do we go about acting? And our goal is to have a coherent approach to action, which we get to by adding these things together. So, the first part of what comes next is ontology. And ontology is going to be discussed in the terms of, there's the traditional science that you all have heard and know about, but there is another part of science. And that other part of science involves living, thinking, sentient beings. And guess what? When they teach you the rules of science, they tend to teach them based on the idea that physics is what matters. Well, we're sentient beings, and physics is concerned with unthinking, inanimate particles. And the rules just aren't the same. So we need to have a different way of thinking about what is. Then there's a model of questions to be asking about what it is we know in the epistemology. And finally, there's a different model, something called Kinetic, to ask questions about how we go about acting. So we're going to go through each of these for a little bit of time, because these are the basic tool set for what questions you can ask. All right, so let's start with ontology. So the idea here is, in the beginning, before you decide to classify things as being, as what is, we start with stuff that's very undifferentiated. You don't know what it is. You have to categorize it. You have to put it in some place. Now, some of these things are simple, or are in a manner where they can be ordered. Hierarchy works. Others of these things are complex. Interweavings matter. And I want to introduce here two words that people tend to conflate and think they mean the same thing, but they're actually quite different. So you notice I put up complex here. The word people tend to conflate with complex is complicated. Now, the root of complicated is click. Click means to fold. Things that are complicated are things that have foldings, which means that you can solve the complicated by unfolding them and exposing whatever plane it is, a single surface, that contains the area that you care about. Now, complex has as its root plex. Plex means to weave. So the complex are things that are interwoven. You cannot take apart the complex into single planes. If you unweave the woven, you have destroyed the whole. It goes back to that old nice junior high school or high school thing about, now that you dissected the frog, would you please put it back? You can't. So there is a qualitative difference between the complex and the complicated. The complicated are over here. The complex are over here. We're going to get into that more in a minute. So Science 2 deals with things that Science 1, this nice stuff of simple and ordered, has trouble dealing with. So the first one of these things is a concept known as emergence. And emergence is what happens if I change the level of analysis, the kind of graining that we're doing? Do new qualities arise? So for example, I see a number of couples out here in the audience. And I guarantee that if you were to think about yourselves as individuals, that the qualities that describe your interactions are different than the qualities describe the interactions for you as couples. Something has emerged when I put you together as a couple. Something more emerges when I consider your family. Something more emerges when I consider your neighborhood or village, etc. Well, Science 1 is not good at dealing with emergence. The next one is the fact that, again, we're sentient beings. We tend to think about things. Not only do we think about things, but we tend to anticipate things. Because we anticipate and because we think, we have a quality known as reflexive anticipation. Before we act, sometimes, not always, sometimes we think about what it is we're going to next do. Sometimes in thinking about what we next do, we don't do it, or we do something different. Particles in physics do not have the quality of reflexive anticipation. They do not have the luxury of saying, what am I about to do? Is it what I want to do? No, I want to do something different. If they did, physics would be very different. So again, this is a difference in Science 2 that is not in Science 1. The next one is that nasty one that we've already talked about a little bit. Will, volition. You make choices. Yes, there are people who want to argue that everything is preordained and that there's no choice. But if we leave those people aside, most of the time, going through our lives, we recognize we make choices. Particles in physics don't make choices. Gases that are gathered to do chemistry or those kind of things do not have molecules that make choices. So Science 1 just does not deal with these three things. So what does it mean? Well, in Science 1 we use deduction and induction. So sometimes we can deduce things directly, sometimes we do a set of probabilities, and from the probabilities we infer something, and that's induction. In the world of sentient beings that have will and emergence and reflexive anticipation, we can't do that. It doesn't work. Again, this is not something that usually gets taught. All we can do is something that's known as abduction, and it doesn't mean please kidnap me. It's the same word, but that's not what it means. So abduction is reasoning to a best explanation, but, and there's a big but here, always being willing to revise in light of new information. The always willing to revise does not tend to be part of these two. So how do we go about expressing these things? In Science 1, we might use descriptions, we might use probabilistic inference, we tend to use a lot of math, we like to use labels. Those shortcuts don't work all that well in Science 2. Instead, we need narratives. We need to talk about context. We need to talk about factors. We need to talk about what matters. And when instead we try to resort to using labels and math, many times, not always, but many times, we get it wrong. And we get it wrong because in that narrowing process that I talked about at the beginning, we're leaving out the things that matter. The way I always like to refer to this is we've somehow invented homeopathic babies. Now, so you've all heard the expression that you've thrown the baby out with the bathwater. It is my belief that when you do these things with labels and math, where you needed the narratives, where you needed the context, then what you're asserting is that somehow when you threw the baby out, that the shape of the baby remained in the bathwater, and that it's okay, that somehow we have this homeopathic baby still around. So, the notions of what you do in Science 1 and Science 2 are different. The notions of what is are different. So, Science 1 is very concerned with prediction. Its entire set of techniques are, how do I go about reliably predicting something? It tends to be very retrospective looking. For the most part, it's closed to emergence. It doesn't really have a role for observers. In fact, one of the things you get told is, please get rid of the observer. Observer bias is bad. Now let's try to compare that to Science 2. In Science 2, we can't do predictions, so instead we have to be looking about preparedness. How can we be resilient? How can we be robust? How can we be prepared for the unknown that may be coming next? We tend to be thinking ahead. We do anticipatory and proactive thinking. We explicitly embrace the idea that emergence happens. That taking into account the change in coarse graining actually affects what matters. We include observers. We use a lot of narratives and we talk about a lot of what ifs. It's a different way of looking at the world. So, if we're going to go on from there, there's one key word on this slide. Only one. Lossy. Lossy means, can we lose some of the information in what matters? Science 1 is concerned with making things as least lossy as possible. You want reliable prediction. You want to do all those nice statistics. You want to make sure that things are reproducible and are very reliable. Science 2 is far more into the, is it good enough? Can I make a heuristic? Can I do something that helps me figure out what's next? I have to leave things in reserve. Lossiness becomes part of Science 2. And it's the enemy of Science 1. So now we're going to go to epistemology. So again, I'm using big words. I apologize. And this is a model for what questions to be asked. So first we said what is, and we had a distinction about lossiness. This is now, how do we ask questions about what is? So, as it said, epistemology is about how we make use of our knowledge to better understand the world. And our goal is to increase our sense of coherence. So we start in with the questions. So the first set of questions is another nasty word, forgive me. It's German, it comes from Husserl. The word is called Fundierung. In my work, I believe that Fundierung is probably the most important thing I study. Fundierung is those things that we take for granted that allow us to believe that there's a possibility for action. So let me give you the simplest example. You take out a pen and you write. While you are writing with the pen, you take for granted the fact that the pen has ink in it that flows to some kind of a point that will be delivered to the paper. If you didn't take all of that for granted and you stopped to examine how the pen worked, you would stop writing. And really the only exception for that are the people that engage in fancy calligraphy, who stop and actually do change their focus to how is it that the process of writing is going on. So the second key word is a word from environmental psychology, and it's called affordances. So affordances are joint properties of an actor and the environment. And they are, what possibilities are there for action? So I'm going to give you an example. You're all sitting in chairs. One of the possibilities afforded to you by that chair is for you to sit in it. It also allows you to stand on it. It also allows you to use it as a shelf. It also allows you to use it as a book rack. It allows you to use it as a coat hanger. If you were to do something that would get Don very upset, you could take the bottom of the seat off the thing and you could use it to hit somebody. So, I mean, there is an affordance of it being used as a weapon as well. All of these are affordances of the chair. They are joint properties, however, of you and the chair. The chair can't do any of those things by itself. It needs somebody to do it with it. So, the next two parts of this are, again, so a big word and a little word. So the big word is pronounced synodoche. I prefer to call it synecdoche, but that's just because I'm from New England and I can't pronounce things. But this is a part of speech that you may have learned if you actually took advanced English classes. Most of us, if we did learn it, skipped right past it. It was on the list of parts of speech, and we saw it once and answered a question and then forgot about it. But synodoche is when we refer to wholes by parts. So we do this all the time when we use labels. We say that something is part of a category, the category has a label, and we now start referring to the thing by its category label. And we ignore all the rest of the thing. So at times we might refer to Republicans. We might refer to Democrats. We might refer to athletes. We might refer to intellectuals. Those are parts. They're labels. When we refer to them, we're not taking into account the rest of what goes on. We're counting on the part of the label. Now, the other thing that we do is that we tell stories. And we have models of how things go on. And you notice that I have here, I said, but a strict definition. The kinds of models that matter are not the, oh, this is a swimsuit model, not that definition. And no, not the toy train. But instead, something that allows us to run a scenario in our head, draw a conclusion, and act on it. And if there isn't a linkage, encoding and decoding, between the thing we run in our head and our ability to act, under this definition, it's not a model. And I want to be very careful here because we use and abuse the term models a lot. So people may say, I have a mental model of what a Republican is versus a Democrat. That is not a model. That is a synodoche. They are different. So what happens when we are questioning how the world is organized and how it is we understand the world? The tool set here is to ask questions among these four things. What possibilities for action do I see? What am I taking for granted in seeing those possibilities for action? When I'm taking these things for granted and I see them, am I making use of labels and categories? And is there more to the picture? And am I actually drawing some kind of model and telling myself a story based on a model? Or is there no model and I'm just using a label? If I'm just using a label, why? Again, coming back to the taking it for granted and what does that mean? There's an entire host of questions here amongst these things. And the more that we can train ourselves to ask, the different ways we will think about how we think about the world. So, again, this model has got some big words in it, and I apologize. And there'll be more on this later, people can get it on the web, etc. But it's a set of questions, and the important thing here is, what questions do I ask among these four things? All right, now we're going to switch to the third area, which is we've done ontology. We've asked the questions about what is. We've done epistemology, and we've said we're going to ask questions about what we know, but we still need to act. So praxeology, this other big word, is about what is the basis of our actions. And there are many different models about how we go about doing this. I'm going to put one up that I believe gives you access to the kinds of questions that help. And that, again, is the point of all this, giving you access to questions. So what you want to do is say, how do I put things together given a context so that I feel comfortable acting? And I want to cite a word here that most people, again, don't tend to be very careful with how they use it. So when you act, for the split second that you act as if you were certain. For that split second, there's one choice. So uncertainty is when you are unable to get to that willingness to act. That is different than ambiguity, where there's multiple choices and you're not quite sure what to do, or equivocation, which is there's multiple choices and you're not sure what to do. Uncertainty is about this lack of having a willingness to act. So the questions that I'm about to show you about, how do you figure that action out? So the model is something called Kinetic. Kinetic is a Welsh word. It means how do we deal with the world around us. The model comes from some work that a bunch of people did at IBM and now do out on their own. And if you were into the agile programming world, I have no idea if anyone out here is a software programmer, but if you were, this is the big thing in agile programming. But I don't care about it for that. I care about it because it gives us some good questions to ask about how we go about acting. So the Kinetic model says, all right, let's start down here with the simple. In the simple part of the world, we know about cause and effect. Prediction works. And because we know about these things, what we need to do is sense what's going on, categorize, apply a label. And we can have rules of thumb or best practices that go along with those labels. Categorization and best practices work best down here. Now, instead we can get to things that are more complicated. And if you remember, complicated is things that are folded up and be unfolded. So now they're, instead of known, they're potentially knowable. We need to go through some kind of exercise in order to figure out cause and effect. We don't just know it. We have to figure it out. And because we have to figure it out, one of two things happens. Either we've got to go through the experiments and try it, or we can go all the way back to that picture I had up about intuition and experience. If there are experts, if there is a master versus the apprentice, it may be that there are experiences that are held by others, that are someplace out there in the community that you can rely on. And that those experiences do work and turn this potentially knowable back into the known. So now the question is, sense, analyze. Look at what's going on, conduct an analysis, and then respond. Notice, here it was categorized, here it's analyzed. Now we move over to the complex part of the world. In the complex part of the world, we don't know except after the fact. This is why we tell stories. This is why we tell narratives. In this part of the world, we can't really predict. So this goes along with the science 2 issue. In this part of the world, we're going to probe. We're going to look at the results of our probes and sense what it is it tells us. And then we're going to try to make sense out of it and respond. So we're going to be very much engaged in telling stories and looking at the stories that we have access to. And then we get to the stuff that's a real mess. And the stuff that's a real mess, which we might call the chaotic or the incoherent, as best as we try, we can't really figure out cause and effect. It doesn't repeat. We're not sure what's going on. The patterns aren't really there. Sometimes there's a pattern. Sometimes there isn't. Oh my God, what do we do? In this part of the world, all you can do is act and then see what happens. These are all very different responses to the world. It's very important to know what part of the world you're in. So if you go through the ontology and epistemology questions, you can get a better sense of where in the world I am to have a better basis for acting. So again, in the known part of the world, things are repeatable, you can use rules. Up here, they're repeatable and you can focus on the experience of others and experts. Here, you're telling stories and trying to figure out what's what. And now down here, you got to act first. You've got to have some basis for action that's completely different than anything else. You're just going to go. So we've got 4 different realms and different sets of questions to ask about them. And now I've gone through the 3 areas of what it is I want you to focus on as these are the sources of questions. When we go to try to put it together, we need to remember our objective is thinking and acting. We're not just sitting here to think for the sake of thinking, and hopefully we're not acting without thinking. But we do that plenty of times. So, as the slide points out, nothing is perfect, life is messy, relationships are complex, outcomes are uncertain, people are irrational, or as the t-shirt says, ordinary life is complex stuff. We live in a complex world. A lot of the media will instead tell you that we can deal with this by trying to make things simple. Well, simple is fine in the simple part of the world. Simple is not fine in the complex part of the world. If I need to tell a complex story about what happened to my family, and somebody was in a car crash, and somebody got a divorce, etc., trying to capture that in 140 characters of a Twitter message is stupid. Trying to label it as, oh, that was story number 127. Yes, if we've all been through the experiences with each other zillions of times, then yes, we can label it as story number 127. But to a stranger, that doesn't mean anything. The other thing that the media does is they say, well, the way you react to the complex is with random. That doesn't work. If you're really, really, really lucky, it might work. But most of the time, that isn't how you're going to get there. And we've got the illustration of the Rubik Cube. And if anyone's actually solved the Rubik Cube by picking it up and merely spinning without bothering to look, I'm sure we all like to meet you. It just doesn't work that way. So we don't tend to teach, though, that we live in a complex world. Instead, we teach you to get rid of it. So what is it that we teach? We teach the scientific method, which is all about prediction and getting to reliable prediction. We teach the idea that when you can't deal with emergence and volition and the possibilities of change, what do? You merely assert that lovely phrase that we all learn in economics, ceteris paribus. All other things remaining equal. We don't live in a ceteris paribus world, but we somehow think it's okay to assert that in part of what we teach. We go through a lot of inductive reasoning and probability inferences without bothering to mention that context matters and that what really is going on is abductive. So, what do we teach? We teach that rationality outweighs emotion. That it's okay to use a label as if it was a model. And that we don't need to worry about multiple perspectives. Why do you need multiple perspectives? It's good enough to just do the one thing. So it's going around the complexity. It's not dealing with it. It's not adapting it. It's just avoiding it. That's not good thinking. So we need to figure out how to deal with it, and we could go through all this stuff, it doesn't matter. The point is, deal with it, not avoid it. Just dealing with it is what matters. So, what's our goal? Our goal is to make things as simple as they can be, but not too simple. And not simpler than they should be. And to recognize that we live in a complex world and that some of it we can get rid of and some of it we can't. And deal with what we can't. That we've got to look at the things that matter and recognize that context matters, and that often our attention is directed to the wrong things. And then it changes if we stop to think about the things that we're not paying attention to. When we use a metaphor, we tend to focus on the parts that are the same. This is like that. Well, no. This is like that in a particular manner with regard to some particular aspect. And this is very different than that in all these other things. We tend to focus on that which is the same and ignore that which is different. And it may be that that which is different is more important. But we often don't stop to ask. So, history matters. I guess I'll read you the Dewey quote. No matter how ardently the artist may desire it, he cannot divest himself in his new perception of meanings funded from his past intercourse with his surroundings, nor can he free himself from the influence they exert upon the substance and manner of his present being. If he could, and did, there would be nothing left in way of an object for him to see. We are products of the history that we've been through. How we frame things matters. I mean, this is a quote from Stephen Jay Gould, but again, I come back to Mr. Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in economics for this. How you frame makes a huge difference. And a lot of us frame really badly. So, how do we go about changing some of this? How do we go about thinking about how we think? And what I'm hoping is that what I've presented to you is a roadmap for how to move ahead. So, what are the requirements? The requirements are that we think about all these things. What context are we in? What are the ontology questions, the epistemology questions, the basis for action questions, the actions themselves, with a goal of trying to make sense of things and be coherent. And not just assume that, okay, I can assert coherence by the assertion of a label and be done. So, we can start with current methods. We can explore what's going on. The exploration is part of the epistemology and the ontology. We can try to figure out what context we're in. Again, ontology questions here. We can figure out what the basis of our actions are. And if we do all of this together as a set of questions, we have a roadmap for better thinking. So this becomes the roadmap. If you're taking the course, this is what we're going to be doing over the next 3 days and then 6 weeks, with some examples and trying to expand this out. But again, the important takeaway is you can ask questions in these 3 areas, and if you do, they will change the way you think about thinking itself. So I'm going to leave you with this. Knowledge is not a matter of getting reality right, but rather a matter of acquiring habits of action for coping with reality. And the goal of all this was to try to give you some other tools, or at least thinking about some other tools for how to cope. And with that, I'm going to say thank you. Questions? Arguments?
Observations.
Observations? The lady in front, please.
What I just, in a layperson's term, it sounds like you're basically encouraging people to remain more open-minded. And I basically think it leads to less coherence and more, it would be less coherence. I think it actually leads to opening up rather than coherent, adherent, whatever theory is in the Latin phrase, whatever.
The risk is a simple one.
Yes.
If you are not open to these other things, then you might be asserting a false coherence, where the label that you are asserting and that narrow context that you are asserting is right within the narrow context. And then you confront a whole different context, and this label that you're asserting makes absolutely no sense. And so yes, in the simple part of the world, in the known part of the world, being open-minded may not help you at all. But that isn't most of the world. And the problem is that if you just say, oh, I'm going to be open-minded without any rigor, then you can end up in exactly the problem you described, where it's just a muddled mess. So I'm trying to give you some tools for rigor about how to go about being open-minded. But no, just open-mindedness for the sake of open-mindedness isn't going to get you very far either.
Very interesting presentation, but do you see it relevant to the common man, or is it reserved or used only by the intellectually elite?
This is usable if you take away questions and examples. Now, the language is horrible for the common man. You know, if people have suggestions, I would love to hear them, because quite frankly, those huge words and the stuff from German, etc., turns people off immediately. I don't have any other good words at the moment, and I'd love to hear some. But yes, it is not that hard to apply. It just requires stopping to think about it. So let me give you a simple example that'll prove the point. So the simple example is we have lots of debates in this country that are very emotionally charged. People are very upset about things like abortion and gay rights and gun control and what to do with the economy, and they get very upset. Applying the labels to the other side of the equation of, you are evil, does not help address the problem. Many of us resort to that. It may express the emotional frustration you're feeling with the other side, but it isn't going to get you anywhere with the problem. You need some other tools so that you can stop merely telling the other side that they're evil. It doesn't help anything for the President of the United States to say, the Republicans have to get their act together. Lovely. That doesn't mean anything. So there are ways of applying things, but the question is, can we give people other questions to ask so they might find some way of engaging? The entrepreneur who is dead set in the belief, and I've been in this role, that I have invented the next great thing, and I'm going to pour all the money in, and I'm going to keep doing it. And I raise money from other people because they share in my belief. And I've got that mindset. Well, the problem with that mindset is, oftentimes, I can't see the roadblocks that are coming up, and I easily can spend my way to bankruptcy in my pure belief that it's going to work. And if you can introduce some other ideas along the way, you might be able to forestall that. But not if they're just, the blinders are on and it's going to work. Yeah.
I want to ask my question before I have to go teach class. You've been thinking about this stuff for a long time, back to when you were still an investment banker. So I'm wondering, how did it influence your life as an investment banker? I'm not asking for investment advice, but how did these kind of things influence how you did your work and approached life as an investment banker?
I wish I had given these things much more thought when I was an investment banker. And most of the time when I was an investment banker, and again, to put some context on this, for 14 years, I was a senior banker on Wall Street. I was one of the people that ran Smith Barney. I ran, or one of the people that ran their public finance division, which is the part that financed state and local governments. And the reality is I did a lot of that on autopilot. All the things that I've said are the lessons of what not to do is how we did it. And really only when I started getting emotionally troubled about what was going on, when I recognized that what I was being required to do was wrong, and that I had to go do it every day, The net result of which was that I ended up going undercover and working for the FBI, which then made it worse, because I had to keep doing the wrong things, and I had to keep then telling people about the wrong things, but yet doing them. If we want to talk about cognitive dissonance, that was a serious set of issues. It is then that I started really thinking about this stuff. And I didn't really start thinking about it until I said, I can't keep going on autopilot, or I'm just not me. I've become some kind of automaton, and I don't like who I see in the mirror. And it is that got me to blow the whistle, and it's that got me to start reflecting on these things. But it is very easy, especially if you're getting very well paid, great encouragement. And you know, look, I started getting paid $1 million a year when I was 26 years old. So I got lots of great encouragement early on. And you go on automaton. And you know, it takes a long time and a lot of thinking to pull back from that. I don't know if that answered your question, but that was the experience. Yeah?
You know, you talked about Science 1 and Science 2. I see that you have used Science 1 to explain your Science 2 to this audience, which is kind of ironical for me because you know, I'm trying to relate it with a quote given by Albert Einstein. A problem cannot be solved at the same level of thinking that created it. Your Science 2 is more advanced and sophisticated than Science 1. And if you think that Science 1 can explain the mental processes of Science 2, that is a little more complicated for the layman to understand. Can you?
Yes, well, you've asserted a belief that isn't there.
Okay.
Science 1 and Science 2 are equals. Neither is better than the other. They operate in different parts of the world. So it is not the case that Science 2 is more advanced. Science 2 is about the part of the world where there are sentient beings. Science 1 is about the part of the world where there aren't. And usually when we explain things, unless we are telling stories, we are explaining things by using labels and categories and models. And those are not sentient things. So yes, unless I'm engaged in telling a story where I put in people or animals, I am stuck using the language of Science 1 to talk about this. Because that's the language we all learn. And yes, if I were in a different place and we had a lot more time, I could probably get to the same points by telling you lots of stories and lots of narratives and have you infer all the stuff I just said. And that would be Science 2. Science 2 is not particularly efficient. Science 1 is geared for efficiency. Science 2 is much more resilient than Science 1. Science 1 is much more efficient than Science 2.
So
I was given 2 hours. I wasn't given a lifetime.
Yeah. Sorry.
Back then here. Yeah.
To his point, I can see the two of them as both separate, co-equal, and intermeshing. One of my passions right now is nutrition, looking at the state of nutrition for various health reasons. And it's just driving me crazy, because I was trained as a biologist, but I was also trained as an artist. So I've got both sides working in my head. And then, although I'm not as formal as you are, I can see
let me give you an example. So we're in a school,
Yeah.
and especially in a university setting, ADHD and the pills for ADHD are a concern.
Yes.
The newest research that came out over the past couple of weeks suggests very strongly that some large portion of ADHD problems are actually sleep disorders. And that giving people pills for ADHD is doing exactly the wrong thing. The solve it with a pill is science 1. The figuring out how people are living their lives and recognizing that maybe there's a sleep disorder that needs to be addressed by having them change how they go about their lives is science 2.
Exactly.
However, 2 years from now, there will be another explanation for it as part of the problem.
That, whenever you say that the explanations could get revised, you're dealing in a science 2 complex world. That is the world we live in. It would be nice if we could say, here's real knowledge, and I know for a fact that this is what causes it. And sometimes we know that, but oftentimes we don't.
What I'm saying basically is a lot of the stuff like that you're talking about is based on bogus information, it's bogus science. And if you go and look at the research behind it, you'll find that you can see the groups that they study, whatever they do, they just change the group, they change the outcome.
That, again, which just means you need to ask the questions about what's going on. I will come back to you and then to you, but you have a question first.
So I have a question. I'm just trying to kind of understand the science 1 versus science 2. It's like science 2 seems like all narratives, and I personally learn better from a narrative story. And is that what you think is more effective? Because, like, as an example, if you look at the statistic for science 1, like 14% of people that text and drive get in an accident, let's just say. And then if you have a story for science 2 where you talk about your brother got killed in a texting and driving accident, is that kind of how you relate the same thing in the different sciences?
Yes, you have it, exactly. Back to you and then.
The only thing I was going to say is, in terms of things changing every week, what we hear in the popular press, of course, doesn't reflect what the actual research is. And the best quote I've heard all week, which is my t-shirt for the week, is that science exists on the edge of ignorance. And that is that it is very, very dangerous to make predictions out of what we know in science, because we know so little, and we are always going for more. So to say that, next week we're going to get different advice is often true, but we have to accept that's the nature of our knowledge.
Well, the other thing that you've got to keep in mind is we live in a world where the media has been conditioned over the past 50 years
Yes.
to go from in-depth narrative to snippets,
That's what I was saying.
right? And the problem is we do not have educated interpreters. The interpreters actually interpret from ignorance.
Most of them are.
And so to say, so somebody might have tweeted, ADHD is sleep disorder. That fits within 140 characters. That doesn't tell the story. But that could get picked up in the national press and end up being the TV program and everything else. And it becomes meaningless. Plus, actually reading all the way through, let's take a horrible example that has now come to haunt the world. There were these major economists who put out a study that said, by their math, and what got picked up as the little snippet was, when debt exceeds 90% of GDP, that growth stops. That was the Twitter quote. That was the summary from their research. If you actually went through all the research, as some people did and published over the past month, you will discover that these people made a fairly significant error in their Excel spreadsheet. And that there was no such threshold. But the media and the policymakers all took the little snippet. And the world has been faced with, you shall embrace austerity, based on this nice Twitter quote of, at 90% growth stops. Guess what? 90% growth doesn't stop. It doesn't even slow meaningfully down. But that became the policy prescription based on the snippet. I will come back to you, but he had his hand up first.
I might have to apologize to the young man over there because I didn't hear all of his question. I think what I have to say is similar, but in terms of what you're saying, does it matter whether Science 1 and Science 2 are converging or diverging? And
because Science 1 and Science 2 are equal and operating in slightly different domains of the world, they can neither converge nor diverge. They just are ontologically distinct. All right? So the part of the world where reliable prediction is a reasonable goal, where we can deal with the inanimate, where we can do deduction and induction fine, is a different part of the world than the part of the world where emergence happens, where reflexive anticipation happens, where there's volition, where we have thinking beings. And the models that apply in one are not the models that apply in the other. So they don't converge, and they don't diverge. They're just different. Yes.
I work in human services area, but I'm a database manager, and people are always asking, give me the figures behind this. What do these figures mean? They want a real short, easy answer, proven by the numbers. When the problem is much more complex. I mean, it can be used to help define policy and procedure, but it's not something that should be used to prove a particular.
All right, so now I'm going to put on my MBA professor hat, and I'm going to say, okay, we teach people IRRs, internal rates of returns, and how to calculate net present values, etc. And one of the things that I always tell my students is, if a decision boils down to a particular rate of return or a little bit of a numerical factor and a net present value, you are not making the decision based on the right things. Something else is more important. If those numbers are wildly divergent between two things, the numbers give you a clue that there's something different going on, and maybe that's enough. But if the numbers are very close, choosing them on the basis of this one is a little bit bigger than that one is probably a very poor basis for making the decision. And that what you need to do is probe behind that. So again, I was lucky. When I was taught accounting, I was taught that the accounting statement was a very fuzzy Polaroid snapshot. And that your goal was to use the snapshot to ask questions. And the way I hear that most people are taught it nowadays, they're still taught that it's a fuzzy snapshot, but that your goal is to try to figure out how to bring it into focus. It's not the numbers. It's the story that the numbers are trying to tell. And the questions that get evoked by the numbers that allow you to tell a narrative. And it's the narrative that matters, not the number. But that's a very hard thing in a world where people want numbers, they want short answers, they want snippets, and we've got corporate environments where the boss says, don't give me more than a page. Well, that's great. If you live in a simple environment, I can give you lots of no's that are not more than a page, and you'll do fine. And if you're going to tell me that the President of the United States can decide whether or not we should go to war with Syria on the basis of a one-page memo, I'm going to politely suggest you're crazy. Sir.
Still on Science 1 and 2, you say something about creation science fits into that setting.
Well, creation science is its own interesting discussion. So I think what one has to do is say, in both the evolutionary sciences, the religious points of view, and the intelligent design points of view, there are very large gaps in the story. Each of the three has a different way of trying to fill in the gaps. creationists would suggest that the way you fill in the gap is with some kind of higher being that has intelligence that is making reflexive, anticipatory, volitional choices. The intelligent design people would suggest that somehow a mechanism was put into place that reflects the outcome of such choices, but they don't quite know where it came from. And the evolutionary people will go far more down at the roots and say, here's a whole set of processes that produce things. But they've got a problem of that there hasn't been quite enough time for it actually to have emerged from the smallest units. So they haven't got any kind of an explanation for how the chunking occurs. And the evolutionary explanation works great if you could figure out chunking. Intelligent design starts by assuming chunking but doesn't tell you where it came from. And the creationist explanation says there's some other being. Maybe all three are right. They operate in different domains, and the people end up talking past one another. So I don't know whether I'd label any of them as Science 1 or Science 2. The evolutionary people would like to think it's Science 1, but they can't explain chunking. Well, here's the problem. The chunking problem is a very simple one. If you start off with just random collection of a mess, all right, we know that, for example, we have protein folding, and we know we have the animal forms that we have, etc. There hasn't been enough time for these things to have emerged purely from the random interaction processes. You end up needing everything to have gone right too many times. Maybe it happened, but the odds are highly against the idea that every time there was a fork in the road, just the right thing happened. So you can overcome that problem if you say, well, things didn't happen starting from the littlest things, but there were chunks. So there was a niche in the world that said motion would help. So things evolved to move. There was a niche in the world for predators, so there was a large chunk for predation. There was a niche in the world for some other process. But those processes are a lot bigger than little cells getting together doing some particular thing, or molecules or proteins getting together to do some little thing. And you can't get from the little stuff to the bigger stuff in the amount of time we believe the universe has been in existence. So it just doesn't work. The processes all work. We can see the processes working, but there hasn't been enough time. So you've got to find some way of chunking the stuff together if you want to use that explanation to account for what's here. They don't tend to teach that.
There's a small observation here that might have a bearing on what you just said, and that's 90% of all species that ever existed on Earth are not on Earth anymore. They're gone. So there was enough time for them to come, evolve, and become extinct. So there were numerous events that caused that. So I have a little bit of problem with your premise that there wasn't enough time for things to be.
You can do, unfortunately, you can do the math. And the math says that you end up needing something like 10 to the 700 and something nanoseconds, or whatever you want to call them, in order for it to occur, and we're shy by about 10 to the 300th power. All right, so when I say there hasn't been enough time, it's by infinite orders of magnitude. So even if you said that every molecule in the universe was acting as some kind of computational device, and you allowed for them all to interact with each other for the entire length of time related the universe to be in existence, you are still shy by 10 to the hundreds. It just doesn't work.
Well, I think if you look at individual traits and looked at DNA structure and said, okay, there's like 97% similarity here.
But the math still, believe, there are plenty of people that have been through this. The math just does not work. You need chunking. The only way you can get there is chunking. And once you say you need chunking, the evolutionary theory doesn't have an explanation for chunking. It's just a gap in the theory.
What initiates chunking?
We don't know. But what we do know is that for there to have been enough time and resources for these things to have occurred, if you want to say that the evolutionary process started from the littlest stuff, there hasn't been enough time. So the only way I can solve that gap is to say it doesn't start with the littlest stuff. It starts with combinations of the stuff. That's chunking. How did the stuff get decided to get chunked together? Did it decide? Did it arrive as whole cloth in chunks? Where did the chunks come from? There is nothing in evolutionary theory to answer that question. It's just not there.
But doesn't your belief in how it happened, or your primary thought process of how that happened, this is part of your epistemology of all the problems and situations, or many of the problems and situations that you find in your life, like the solving of the abortion problems and gun violence and all those different things. I mean, you view them from a different point of view. Many times you can relate it right back to your view on creation and religion, moral code.
All right, so now I'm going to use a short word, but it's another ugly word, so I apologize. But what you've just described is something known as doxa, D-O-X-A, which is basically your basic beliefs. The beliefs that you sort of hold independent of the rigorous pursuit of knowledge that you may have otherwise undergone. All right? And yes, we all carry a doxa around in our head. Some of us carry multiple doxa around in our head. And the doxa are one of the things that is taken for granted, that will affect the framing that you do, that will affect the choices, that will affect how you believe things. And you can't just get rid of it by saying, oh, ceteris paribus, we're going to deal with economic rational man. Well, economic rational man exists in an economics textbook, and I've never met one in my life. I mean, Dale's no longer here, but his example of the economist is, you can always tell an economist because he's the person who refuses to bend over to pick up a 20. All right, why? Because if it was a real 20, somebody else would have picked it up, so it can't be real, so why bother?
Clarification.
Yes?
You use the word doxa and belief. Is it doxa and values?
Well, values are beliefs. They are just a subset of your beliefs. You have beliefs about things that you say are values, and you have beliefs about things that you say are quote-unquote facts. But they're still all beliefs. So I believe that you're all standing here in front of me. I could be wrong. This could all be a bad dream. I don't know.
They're not in front of you.
Yeah. Yes?
Colleague couldn't be here, so he's probably going to watch this recording now. So this happened. He was discussing something you read recently about first brain, second brain. Are you familiar with that? And is that science one, science two?
Could you repeat the terms again?
First brain, second brain, or something?
Oh, that's the dual process theory. That goes back to, let's go back way in the beginning of the lecture when I said the rational part and the emotional intuitive part. That's the science. It's not science one, science two. That's the cognitive scientists believe, their current working theories, that there are these two processes that occur in your head. Now, some other people believe that there's actually many processes that are occurring in your head, and that to call them two is false. And then there are other people who say, no, this is all actually rational, and your emotions and intuitions are just a figment of your imagination. But the leading theory in cognitive science right now is this dual process theory. And that's brain one and brain two, if you want. Yeah?
Question regarding, you used some examples to drive some of your points regarding the financial, the industry and certain things. And decisions do need to be eventually based off research, facts, numbers. Decisions need to be made, and so this process is great in theory, but is there a risk of allowing, using the example of ignorant versus intelligent person using this process to then use as an scapegoat of the questions haven't been asked. We haven't asked enough questions, because a lot of this is based on, are we asking the right questions, are we asking enough questions? But then we get into decisions don't get made because they continue to say, well, we haven't asked the right questions, we haven't asked enough questions. So could this, in theory, be great, but run a risk of decisions don't get made, actions don't get put in. Hence, let's say you use the politician and like a few examples. We are in situations now economically because decisions haven't been made, even though they're just asking the same questions, just providing different answers. They're not asking multiple questions. So I'm just curious, is there a risk there in
there is no
continuing
question
to ask questions?
there's no question that what I've explained could be abused by a bureaucracy as a massive justification for inaction and stalling tactics. All right? There's absolutely no question. All right? I may have just provided a lovely intellectual cover for bureaucracies to do all kinds of nasty things. But the other side, the side comment to that, though, is by not acting, by not deciding, we are still acting and we're still deciding. And to assert that the postponement of a decision is not in and of itself the making of a decision is incorrect. It is the making of a decision. It's the making of a decision to postpone. It is the making of a decision to allow status quo to continue. And it is a mistake to allow the language to switch over into, I'm not deciding. The answer is, you are deciding to keep what's current for the moment, and you are opting not to change. That is the decision. Yes?
Michael, you did address this earlier, but I want to go back to the Science 1, Science 2. I think there is a problem with Science 2 in that there's bias. There's the bias that we try to avoid in Science 1 by being objective. And so is it possible that the decisions or the conclusions that we arrive at in Science 2 need some form of support from Science 2, Science 1 rather? In that there is coherence between the two.
You have made an assertion that, again, I will respectfully suggest does not hold. And the assertion that you are making is both that Science 1 is objective, and the other assertion that you're making is that objectivity is a goal. And I would politely suggest that Science 2 is very explicit that there is no objectivity and it is not a goal. That we exist only in the Science 2 part of the world is subjective. And that subjective world cannot be manipulated by making false claims of objectivity that have no actual basis. So it may be that you can derive things that you will claim to be objective in Science 1. That does not make them in any particular instance superior to the subjective narratives that emerge from Science 2. And yes, Science 1 explicitly says, I want to be objective and I want to get rid of the observer and I want to get rid of the biases. Science 2 says, that's lovely. In your part of the world, you can do that. In this part of the world, the actor is also an observer. All actions include observer bias. There is no such thing as objective because things have to be considered from perspective, and perspectives vary. And there is no privileged position. And once you accept all of that, I don't have anything left to your question. Sorry.
Yeah, but then in the business world, the goal is to be objective.
Says you.
And we want to be able to support our conclusions that we may have emotionally come up with even.
And I'm hearing you assert these things, and that's fine. You wish to exist in a Science 1 world of business. That's great. And there are parts of the world where that will apply fine. And if you want to run all that nice math and explain to me why it is that I buy this instead of that, or why I made this choice instead of that choice, I will politely suggest to you that yes, if I am a representative of some statistical sample, you may be perfectly right, but I am Michael Lissack and I make my own decisions. And if you want to say that I did them because I'm part of this group that behaves this way, be my guest. You're likely to be wrong. Well, I would never ask these questions at Smith
But
Morgan.
if you had a compelling direction that was based in the Science 2, would you not have had to frame it in Science 1 language to have it be communicated?
Actually, no, and I did have examples of that. So one of the things that I financed a lot of was resource recovery plants. So that's where you burn waste to create energy. And most people in communities have very emotional reactions to those things, because the reality is you're putting a dump in a location. It's a landfill. It burns things. It has waste. It has odor. It has stench. There are vermin that show up there. There are birds and things that show up there, etc. There is a large narrative that connects with that emotional bit about where you're located and how big it should be. Should it take in other people's waste? Should it only take in our waste? Do we want to make money off of it? Do we want to just put it out someplace where we don't have to deal with it? Almost all of the actual real questions are Science 2 questions, until you get to the point where you actually have to pay for the thing. And then suddenly, when all those other questions got answered, you have to sit down and say, can we afford to pay for it? And I'll give you the example of where I live. I live at the southernmost part of Florida on the Gulf Coast side. We have mandatory recycling. So once a week, I will wheel to the bin a yellow cart that has recyclable materials in it. It is a complete fiction. It has been 12 years since the math has supported the idea that any of those recyclables can go any place other than into the landfill, because it costs more money to truck them to where the market is than you can sell them for in the market. However, because emotionally we all want to believe that we're doing our part for the environment and that we are recycling and that we're doing this, even though for 12 years this has been nonsense, and even though it costs a little bit of extra money to send a separate truck and have a separate bin, we still do mandatory recycling. And it all goes into the same place in the landfill. And until the math changes, it's going to, because it would be really stupid if you can only sell the stuff for $4 a ton to spend $12 a ton trucking it there.
You've been here a while, you probably know about the pebble mine.
Yes?
So my question is, can you write, or do you, as a part of this, do you draft papers that analyze such public policy issues like pebble mine using this approach?
I would hope that my students would be able to do that. I try to take the perspective of, I have stepped back and become the applied philosopher. And I will help you with the philosophy questions and with whether your thinking seems to benefit from engaging in another dialogue. But quite frankly, I last ran for public office 6 years ago, and I have no desire to do that ever again.
And you don't blog.
Beg your pardon?
I said, and you don't blog.
I don't blog? No, I do not blog. I write philosophy books which put people to sleep. I mean, it's just the way it is. No, absolutely not. Actually, I take it back. I take that back. I have absolutely tweeted with respect to, let's see if I can say what I've tweeted on. The local sports team at GCU did well in the basketball stuff. So I, like a bunch of other people, said, go Eagles. So I did do that. I don't know that that counts.
Michael,
Yes.
What's your advice to educational institutions in this context about education? You had some thoughts on that.
I go back to the roadmap. I believe this is the kind of stuff that we need to be teaching. And I don't think we teach it. Obviously, APU is different because I'm standing here. So it's going to get taught here. But for the most part, I don't believe that this is the stuff we teach.
Why do you think that we don't?
It's very difficult for people that have been trained in a Science 1, I must get ahead in the world, I must be accredited, I must publish, etc. The world is set up on this nice, efficient Science 1 basis. And even in the humanities, which is really all about Science 2, they have adopted the rigor of the supposed rigor of the Science 1 world as something they emulate. And it poisons what goes on. Right? This is not how we used to teach people. We used to teach people on the master apprentice basis. They learned all the Science 2 stuff. We used to teach people by having them read folk stories. We used to teach people by having them read novels and narratives. We keep throwing all that stuff away. Why? Well, you can't measure it. Gee, that's funny. Measurement is a Science 1 concept. There is no measurement in Science 2. Yeah.
I just stumbled on this verse of the paper from my background, zero colleges, zero. Are you one of several entities that are teaching this around the country, or are you? Is it? Because I'm fascinated. I think it sounds like absolutely what you're saying. We're not teaching.
There are roughly 20 of us that are teaching this around the globe. Anybody else? So I guess I'm gonna do my bit and say, oh wait, yes.
I'm thinking about after you take action, and maybe your thinking was not clear. Taking your action, can you make that the right decision? Or do you go back to square one?
Well, there's multiple answers to that. So the first answer to that is most of us are pretty good at coming up with excuses and justifications for just about anything. So I could certainly tell a story about why it was the right decision, whether it was or it wasn't. Then the question is, are you open to learning from it? And if you are, then, you know, that changes things. And if you're not, well, then you're not. And I also will remind you something that I learned a long time ago, which is we don't learn by the things we succeed and are good at. We already knew them. We only learn by the things that we muddle through, screw up, and fail. Because that's where there's lessons. Yeah.
Are you saying that in your efficiency, that better thinking is a more or better construct of the entire world that already exists?
What I'm suggesting is that quote-unquote better thinking is thinking more from a perspective about resilience and adaptiveness and leaving yourself open to possibilities, and that efficient thinking is more simple, linear, and direct. And in the simple world, or in the simple part of the world, efficient, linear thinking may be better thinking. But in the more complex part of the world, it is not. Yet the media and most of our educational institutions do not respect that difference. Well, we used to have newspapers that wrote features. We used to actually employ journalists that would write long pieces. It used to be that the news media actually was concerned with telling you a full story. You know, now the news media is interested in racing to see who can spit out the 140 characters before the next one. I mean, you know, it's... we live in a world that is preoccupied by efficiency at the expense of resilience. Well, no. Resilience is not what a lot of people are aiming for. If you think that you can predict the future accurately, then resilience is not part of your goal. You want to be efficient and extract as much as you can. All right? It actually reflects the idea that you have some ambiguity, some equivocation, to decide that resilience is a necessary part of your life. And if you are dead certain in your beliefs, you don't need resilience. There may be unfortunate consequences, but you don't need resilience. Yeah.
Going back to the 20 around the world, is the ultimate goal to shift the pendulum back to what it was? Or what is the outcome? Science 1 year. What are you guys hoping to achieve?
What are we hoping to achieve? Nudging people back to the idea that there's more to the world than the science one part of the world. And if we can get people that far, we think we've accomplished something. I don't actually expect to get a whole lot further than that, except maybe with a few people here and there. If you're going to fight the entire world, you've got to take on the idea that a little victory is a great one.
It just seems like it all stems around greed and ROI on time and maybe elements of laziness and just trying to get that dog eat dog and into about that, about the rat race, I guess, is what's kind of evolved us to this point.
Well, we have been in a world where for the past 150 years, being more efficient has created more resources. But that pendulum is shifting. And we don't recognize that completely yet. And there were major gains to be made by being linear and sorting things into parts and being reductionist and being very efficient. But we're now in a part of our cycle where that's not particularly where the gains are to be had, except at extreme cost. Okay, I think I've scared most of the audience now. So on this note, I think I'm going to say thank you.
It was excellent. Thank you.
Sure. Doesn't work. There isn't enough time for that, unfortunately. That we're going to have to it doesn't, the math doesn't work. I love things floating, it just happens to be a massive gap. No place. Give me a card and I'll send you links to the course notes. That's not true. It's not what they teach. The reality is the math just doesn't work. What are they doing with microphones? Thank you.
certain